Like I said, I just want to give a quick introduction to our panelists today. Amy Aines is the CEO of Damianakis Communications and the co-author of Championing Science, Communicating Your Ideas to Decision Makers. She is a message strategist, speaker coach, and culture architect who is specializing in helping scientists and technologists communicate to get results. And Dr. Roger Aines has been building coalitions to develop climate and energy technologies that remove or repurpose atmospheric CO2. He is the chief scientist of the energy program at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where he leads the lab's carbon initiative to understand, develop, and implement technologies for the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So I'm going to hand it over to them to get started. Thank you both for joining us, and good luck.
Thanks, James. Each one of you, as a scientist, has the potential to make your impact in the world. Think about that. New discoveries, small advancements, all matter. And so does your ability to communicate. In fact, that's why your ability to communicate matters. And that's why we're really glad to have you with us today to share with you some insights and perspective we've gained over the years. I'm Amy Aines, and for the last 40 years, I've spent my career helping scientists and technologists learn to communicate effectively.
And I'm Roger Aines. Nice to meet you all.
My favorite
virtually.
Scientist.
I've spent the last 40 years thinking about technology and how to communicate it. And the last 20 years thinking about climate technology. And we all know how difficult that is to communicate. And as I try to help young scientists do a better job of communicating that, I've thought maybe we should write some of this down. Maybe we should write a book. And then I met Amy. And Amy, as a professional communicator, I knew could help me write a great book on this. And so this spring, we just published our book with University of California Press, Championing Science, Communicating Your Ideas to Decision Makers. And our attempt here is to help all of you do a better job of communicating your science.
And we're really delighted that you've joined us here. We love doing this. In fact, it's what we do outside of our day jobs. And in fact, you could say we're pretty passionate about it. Today, we're going to talk about the pitfalls, typical mistakes you see scientists make as communicators, and give you some really solid advice on how to stand out.
Passion is vital. We all got into science because we love it. And if we transmit that passion to other people, they can love it too. This is incredibly important to show that you really care about things. And when you do that, you bring other people along for the great ride of science, for the excitement of doing that. And that passion is contagious, as Susan Weinschenk tells us, that when you bring that to other people, they're going to feel your passion, they're going to share that emotion. And many times scientists have trouble with that concept. It's like, should I really be passionate when I'm out talking in front of an audience? It's maybe not scientific. Well, if you're not comfortable being really excited, maybe you can just be determined or just curious. You know, sharing those kinds of emotions brings other people along as well. They're all just as good as being passionate. Use the emotion that fits your style.
And how do you show your passion? Well, it's really about using what makes you you, your facial expressions, your voice, the words you say, the way you gesture. Fundamentally, you're trying to convey some energy. And when you think about people who have something exciting to say, usually they talk a little bit faster, their eyes get wide, their face lights up. That's the kind of energy you want to bring. And the time to bring it is the minute you start conversations or presentations. And the reason for that is because that's the moment that everybody's listening. And what most scientists do is the standard opening. Hi, it's really great to be here. I'm so-and-so, this is the work I do. I could have introduced myself first, but what did I do? I fundamentally made a prediction. I suggested that all of you have the potential to do something big with the work that you're doing. You can also reveal interesting findings or ask a what-if question. What if you could use soybean waste to increase crop productivity? That's going to get you listening. So the idea behind having a strong opening line is to get people's attention, make them interested in your topic, connect your interest in the topic to them, and ideally bring in a little bit of emotion, get them feeling your energy around the subject matter. So I want you to think for a minute, and I suggest that you jot a note or two. And throughout this conversation, we're going to suggest little bits of homework for you. I'd like you to think for a minute about what inspired you. Why is it that you do the science that you do? Jot a note about that. And the reason to think about that is because one of the most effective ways to get people engaged is by putting yourself in the story. Take a minute to glance at this story about Scott Kelly. He was not your typical brainiac in high school. In fact, it was a real surprise that he became an astronaut. And this is one of the stories that's in a terrific guide for scientists as storytellers that 3M company has put together as part of the work that they've been doing to help scientists tell their stories and help other people appreciate the impact that science has in their daily lives. I know the Alda Center folks contributed to the guide, so you can see the URL down there, but if you look up 3M scientists as storytellers, you'll find it. So think about your story. That's part of your homework. Reflect on why you found your way to doing the work that you do and what kinds of stories you can tell about your work to engage people as you try to bring them in to be interested in your science. So another real pitfall for scientists, and you come by it really honestly, it's because of the way you're trained, but oftentimes scientists dive too fast into the details. Right, Roger?
Yes. So in our book, we have 11 what we call tenets, principles of good communication in science, and we're going to walk through those. And the second of those is build the big picture first. Why do we want to do that? In science, we always assume that everybody's read all the literature, that everybody knows all the background, that we're just adding on an increment at the end of other science that other people have done over the decades. Well, first of all, it's never really true. Nobody's ever read all the literature. But when you're dealing with somebody who isn't an expert in your field, it's absolutely not true. So you have to always start with what's important. Why are you asking people to listen to you? Why does this matter? My mentor, Jay Davis, taught me that it's really important when you're having a discussion to make sure that you give the other person a chance to participate and make sure you get through the most important material. And in an active conversation, that can often get sidetracked in a hurry. So the active sponsor or a policymaker who wants to know what you're doing or a new collaborator, they're going to get excited. They're going to want to dive in. Make sure you give them the whole story up front and then give them the details as you add things later. Start with the important part. And he developed a concept that we call the 5-slide approach. And you can use this whether you're giving a presentation and really using slides, or whether you're talking to someone, whether you're writing a white paper. The idea is put the important stuff up front. Whether this is 5 slides or 5 sentences or maybe 5 paragraphs, it's the same structure. And if you were asking somebody for money, as these 5 slides might be, the first thing to do is, what's the problem? Why do you care? What does this matter? Second is, what's the gap? What needs to be solved in order to get from where we are to where we want to be? Then, having identified that gap, how might you fill that gap? What would you actually do? Now, in the case of a proposal, you also want to talk about why your team are right for the job, and you're going to want to make an ask. Always make an ask at the end. Ask for something. But if you're talking about, forming a new collaborator or trying to influence a policymaker, it's the same kind of concept still applies. You're going to talk about the important things up front. You're going to take at most 5 minutes to outline what the important things are, and then move on to the details.
And in order to be an effective communicator, you really have to take stock of who's listening. This is where it gets into being a bit strategic and using your skills as a researcher to take a look and understand who it is you're trying to influence in your communication. And let's just say you're trying to invite somebody in to join you to be part of a project. What kinds of things should you try to find out about them? Well, first of all, get a sense of their technical chops. figure out what their areas of interest are. And it's important to get a read on what they think about things. So the internet makes that easy these days. We also recommend you try to understand how they like to receive information. I'll say more about that in a minute. And to the extent you can figure it out, do they lean more toward the introverted side of that continuum, or are they more extroverted? So thanks to the internet, it's pretty easy to start to figure some of this out.
That's me. You can look me up.
And if you take a few minutes and invest that time in researching people, you can do a much better job of tailoring your communication so that it's going to be more effective with them. Easy to find out what people have published. If I'm looking for a partner, I certainly want to spend a fair amount of time understanding the science that they've done. And I also want to know what their opinions are and the things that they're interested in. So Twitter and LinkedIn are great places to find that. Also on YouTube these days, you Google people and you'll find they've given a talk somewhere. And that can sometimes help you tell if they're introverted or extroverted. People tend to be a little more introverted if they're quiet and more reserved. Extroverted people tend to use their hands a lot, talk in a more animated way. That's a proxy for knowing whether they're introverted or extroverted. And the other really important thing that most scientists don't think to do is to try to ask someone who knows that person. So sometimes it's an assistant, sometimes it's someone you can find on LinkedIn who's a colleague of yours and a connection you have who can help you connect to the person that you want to know something about. See what you can find out about the folks that you're spending time with. And in the case of inviting a collaborator in, you want to be able to talk about the great work they've done. You want to find those points of intersection. So doing your homework really pays off. And once you've done that homework, you have a frame of reference for becoming really clear about your purpose. If I want to have somebody sign up and be part of my team, I know I want to influence them. That might not happen right away, but I need to take stock of how they think and what they know in my approach to them. And when it comes to whether or not a person's introverted or extroverted, here are a couple of really important things to know. Introverts oftentimes will be pretty quiet if they haven't had time to think about things in advance. So here's a case where you might want to provide information up front. I might want to send something about the project that we're doing, the kind of skill sets I'm looking for. So I've paved the way for a conversation. Otherwise, keep in mind that if an introvert's quiet, it's not because they don't care or they're not interested. It's because they need a little more time to think about it. And you can take advantage of knowing that by saying, look, I know you're going to need time to think about this, but I wanted to share this with you today. Introverts like one-on-one better than a crowd, so keep that in mind too. If you're going to be in front of an extrovert, they're going to want to dig in and dialogue and brainstorm, and they may get pretty excited about this project that you could undertake together. So be ready for that. Think about the scenarios that you want to bring up. And extroverts really enjoy being asked for their opinion. They almost always have one. And more importantly, they like to think out loud. So they're going to engage with you in a very, very different way. So the importance of knowing who's listening helps you think about how to connect with people and what's important to them. And that's especially important when you're in front of members of Congress or policymakers like you were last summer, Roger.
So one of the more important conversations you'll ever have as a scientist is with a policymaker or somebody who's going to influence a decision. And this is me testifying in front of Congress. The tools that you have available for you here are pretty broad. You don't just think about talking to the member of Congress or making these testimonies I did in front of a committee. You think of working with the staffers. You think about understanding the context for their decisions. And the staff is there to make sure that the 5 minutes that you get with a senator is very useful. And they'll spend an hour with you making sure they understand what you're doing and what you can provide to the senator. And the context is very important. Oftentimes in science, we have a reason that we did the science we wanted to do, but the policymaker has a little different reason they want to know about it. So you need to find out what that reason is. Then you want to inform them. You don't want to make recommendations. Recommendations sound like a demand to somebody like that. You want to give them the gift of information. That's what scientists have. We have information. And so you give them that information and make sure you fill in gaps around what they need, and then they can use that to build the policies that they need or the decisions they need to make. And always make sure that they have the ability to act in the area that you want them to act. For instance, are you talking to somebody who's actually in charge of the budget? Are you talking in charge of somebody who's actually going to write a law that might do the thing that you're interested in doing?
And when we were back in DC, we heard a number of stories about the frustrations that members of Congress have because they get briefed by scientists who come and ask them for something they don't have the authority to do.
And the other thing we heard from them is that everybody in Washington wants to know what scientists think, and they can't find out because they can't understand us. Let's fix that. A second important conversation that you're going to have is with venture capitalists. Remember that VCs fund businesses, not science. So when you get a chance to talk to one of them, whether it's 5 minutes in the hallway or an hour in a formal pitch that you get to make to a VC, always start with the problem that your science is going to solve. Spend most of the time on what that problem is, what the business need is, and only a very small amount of time on the actual science that you're going to do. And very rarely do you need to spend any time on how you actually do it. Spend time on what it is. Focus on the business value. They're going to come back. If they're interested in those two things, they're going to come back to you with long sets of meetings to find out the details of what your science is and who your partners are and what you're actually doing, the due diligence phase. They'll spend days on that. But make sure that you cover the business plan up front. And when we were writing our book, we spent a fair amount of time with venture capitalists, including friend Nancy Floyd from Nth Power, learning about the things that they wanted to hear from scientists and what they were actually hearing. And that's the most important thing, is they were hearing a whole bunch of details. What they wanted to know was, why does it matter?
Yeah.
So always spend more time on why it matters and less time on how you do it. We all love our science and we spent years learning how to do it, but the people who are listening to us don't need to hear those details. What they want to find out is, what did we learn? What impact does it have now? When you're talking to your research group, they want to know those details. Sure, and that's very important because they know all the background, but almost no other audience does. Other audiences want to know, what's at stake? Why does this work matter? And this comes back to the 5-slide approach. This is the problem. This is where you want to start. What is the thing that, why is the listener going to have a better world because they listen to what you have to say about it? My boss, Steve Bolin, used to be the chief scientist of the U.S. Geological Survey. He used to be the chief regulator of the oil and gas division here in California. And he's a terrific communicator. And what he says is he always discusses science in terms of the value to society. It's never about the science. There's beautiful science out there, and many times we're fascinated in science because of its beauty. But in communication, always think first about the value, especially to other people.
And I want to give you a couple of examples that come from this program guide. This is from the 2018 Endeavor program. We were in Australia last year visiting with Prudence Brew and Jackie Sprague, and thanks to them, we now have some great examples to share with you. Here's an example of focusing on the why, talking about a new device that's very helpful in terms of dealing with the pressure concerns when it comes to traumatic brain injury. So the focus here is all about the incidence of the problem, 70 million traumatic brain injuries, the risk, what the current state of affairs is in terms of needing to literally drill a hole and insert a catheter, and how this new approach is going to make a difference.
So at the University of Melbourne, they have this program where every year they let all their students prepare these kinds of pitches and make pitches to policymakers, VCs, et cetera. And this is one of those pitches.
Yeah. Contrast that with this one, which is all about the how. And it's so laden with jargon, and they just assume that we all know the value of a smart meter. Now, I could kind of guess that you would know it measures something, but this is the kind of thing that would not make me stop to find out more about what these guys are doing. So when you focus on the why, it's far more engaging. As a starting point, there's a place for the how, but not at the beginning, certainly not at the beginning. So fundamentally, what we're saying here is it's really important to extract the essence of your science. So here's a homework assignment for you. Take a look back at some of your materials and ask yourself, have I done enough to focus on the why? Or am I spending too much time or getting too quickly into the how. Extracting the essence is about finding the fewest number of words to tell your story. It is not dumbing it down. And Roger and I cringe when we hear scientists talk about this because, and we think it's one of the unfortunate mistakes scientists often make in their mindset.
It's one of those memes that we all repeat and we shouldn't.
Yeah, because it's not that people can't understand. It's that the onus is on you to help them understand. But more importantly, it's recognizing that this attitude comes across as intellectual superiority. It comes across as disrespectful, and there is a better way. And we'd like to share our view on that. It starts with taking a 30,000-foot view. What's the big picture view? What's the smallest number of words to get across the main idea? So let's go back to that new device we were just talking about. If I were going to extract the essence about that device, what I would simply say is this. It's a device that monitors pressure in the brain without surgery. Really succinct, fewest number of words. Notice I didn't say measure and monitor, because if you're monitoring, you fundamentally have to be measuring too, right? So I don't need to say measure. And I don't need to say drill a hole and insert a catheter. I can just say without surgery. We all know what surgery is. We all know the impact of having surgery. So that's the idea behind extracting the essence. So take a look at some of the things you've written and some of the presentations you've given and ask yourself, can I take that paragraph? Can I distill it down to a sentence? And then can I find the fewest number of words that really give people the heart of what I want them to focus on? And the importance of doing that as a starting point is so important because people can stay with you. They can immediately engage and know where you're taking them. Here's a great example from some finalists in Intel's Science and Engineering Fair. I was reading the story behind their project, and they talked all about what happens when you add soybean curd residue to soil. And they got into the science of what it does to permeability, on and on and on and on. And I said, okay, how am I going to extract the essence here? Well, it really is this simple. Soybean waste increases crop yield. That's extracting the essence. Here's another example from a new campaign out in California right now. Apparently there's just a huge increase in the number of young people who are vaping because of flavored vapes that taste like candy. So the essence here is about nicotine being brain poison. We all know what the word poison means. It's a high impact word. It immediately communicates. And then we'll be willing to listen to more of the science around exactly what nicotine does. This is the starting point. And for those of you who are entrepreneurs, already running businesses tied to your science or thinking about doing it, I wanted to share one other perspective here. We're working with some folks at Cyclotron Road, affiliated with UC Berkeley. They're an accelerator. And one of the things that they share with their cohort is from Venture Hacks. And Venture Hacks essentially is saying the same thing we are. Extract the essence is very similar to what they call a high concept pitch. One short sentence or phrase used to get people's attention, familiar words and concepts. And I love this quote because it really reinforces the resistance that we think a lot of scientists have to doing this. It just feels way too simple, but that's important as a starting point. So that's the takeaway for you on extracting the essence.
And when you're doing that, you need to think about what those words are going to be for the audience that you're talking about. You want to first be understandable. If people don't understand the words you're using, they're not going to come along with your ideas. You don't want to leave them in the dust. And this is a game that scientists play all the time. We talk about drinking from a fire hose and act like that's really fun. It's not. That would hurt. It's the same when you're talking. You want to use words that people understand and begin with the level of understanding that you think your audience is going to be because you've researched them carefully, right?
And you're the one who's responsible for that. It's not up to them to step up. And that's kind of a flip-flop. I mean, when you're in graduate school, you take in a lot of intense information that you need to learn. But when you're out in the world communicating with other people, you need to turn that around.
one of the most important places to think about that is when you're forming a new team, when you're working with a new collaborator, when you're bringing in another discipline into the work that you're doing. This is the hardest time to get on the same page. And it's very important to focus on what each other are saying, what you mean, what you want to accomplish, what's your goal. As George Shultz says, when land together, you have to take off together. And we think of this in terms of something we call paradigm. This is a super important way for scientists to pay attention to how they're coming across. And the word paradigm that we use here, of course, it's very widely used in the common parlance today, but starting with Thomas Kuhn's work from the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he identified paradigm as the sum of information that all the information that scientists know about a topic. I like to think about it as scientists who share your paradigm are the ones who've done all the same problems at the end of the chapters in all the books. They have the same paradigm that you do. They know the same information. But let me give you an example of that. I'm a geologist. And for me, the phrase mid-ocean ridge basalt conveys an enormous amount of information. It gauges my entire paradigm as a geologist. It starts with the eruption of these deep undersea volcanoes that are putting basalt out onto the floor of the ocean as the ocean spreads. And you have communities of wildlife down there that are living on the volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. And as those things occur, as they spread of the crust in the deep ocean happens, you eventually get this floor of the ocean that has all this complex structure as the plates spread. And on the other side of the continent, you're going to see the plates diving down underneath the Pacific plate, forming volcanoes, forming basically all the geology that makes the surface of the earth as we see it, the grandeur of plate tectonics. I get excited about this. I think it's pretty cool, right? But for many people, rocks are something you find in a stream. It doesn't carry along all that information that I see when I talk about plate tectonics and mid-ocean ridge basalt. So I have to be very careful.
So that's the peril of paradigm. And where we see scientists go wrong is that they don't fully appreciate how much they know and all of the specificity of what they know. And when you don't share a paradigm, which is pretty much always the case with someone who hasn't been trained like you have, you don't have the same ability to understand the same things. You don't have a framework for that. You can't really interpret the words the same way. So here's another homework assignment for you. Jot down and put a timer. I think it's kind of fun if you do this for 3 minutes. Jot down for 3 minutes everything that comes to mind when you think about your version of mid-ocean ridge basalt. What are all those rich concepts that you carry an understanding of because of what you studied?
Whether it's medicine or electronics, whatever your specialty is, what's your paradigm?
Yeah, and put down those acronyms that just, spill off your tongue so easily, because those are things you say all the time. And when you start to become conscious of your paradigm and you tailor your communications to your listeners, you can bridge those gaps. And we wanted to help you understand a little bit more about how to do that. It starts with what we've talked about already: clear, simple, common language. I could have said a non-invasive device, but it's much easier to say without surgery, because I don't have to think as hard when I'm listening to know and process those words. The other really important way to overcome paradigm gaps is to talk at a concept level. And I learned this in my 20s when I started working for a T1 multiplex manufacturer. I didn't really understand the engineers, but what I listened for were the concepts. The questions I asked them got me to understand the concepts, and then I could translate that. And sometimes you're in a situation where you've got a mixed audience. So there's a way that you can honor the fact that you are an expert and there's several sitting with you, but also talk to the people who aren't going to know as much about your topic. And that's by using mixed phrasing. Physicians have gotten really good at this. My doctor's going to tell my surgeon that I've got osteophytes. He's going to tell me that I've got bone spurs. So think about those kinds of translations. It's also important to check in to see if people are understanding what you have to say, but you don't want to do it in a way that shuts them down. So you really want to ask open-ended questions. a member of Congress is never going to admit that they didn't follow what you said. They're just going to shake their head and act as though they do, and then go out and tell their staffer that was a waste of time.
Yeah.
So don't be that scientist.
We heard that several times.
We really did. And one of the most powerful ways to bridge paradigm gaps is by using analogies. And I want to share with you a clip from a 3-minute thesis video that was done by Dustin Chernick. He was a winner back a couple of years ago in Minnesota. And he's talking about glia and uses the analogy of a sponge and cleaning up the kitchen as he talks about Alzheimer's. So take a listen.
These plaques are filled with a protein called amyloid beta, which is being produced in the brains of every one of us in this room right now. Scary, right? But the brain has a number of cells called glia that are normally able to clear away this toxic protein faster than it's produced, kind of like a sponge. So if we think of the brain like a kitchen, then we make dinner, we make a mess, but we clean it up with the sponge. But as we age and our good cholesterol starts to function less effectively, these cells, the sponge, loses its ability to clear away the toxic proteins fast. These plaques are filled with a protein called amyloid beta, which is being produced in the brains of every one of us in this room right now. Scary, right? The brain has a number of cells called glia that are normally able to clear away this toxic protein faster than it's produced, kind of like a sponge. So if we think of the brain like a kitchen, then we make dinner, we make a mess, but we clean it up with the sponge. But as we age and our good cholesterol starts to function less effectively, these cells, the sponge, loses its ability to clear away the toxic proteins fast.
So your opportunity and homework is to think about iconic analogies that you can use to explain your science. It doesn't have to explain the entirety of your science. Find a piece of what you're talking to people about. Anything that you can do to make that's familiar to help people bridge a gap in their knowledge will lead to more understanding. And it's really important for you to recognize that in order to do that, sometimes you have to take a little poetic license, just as Dustin has done here.
These plaques
Okay. Because what you want to do is balance precision with impact. And as scientists, you absolutely need to be precise. That is part of what makes you good at what you do. But as you start communicating with people and you need to help bridge that paradigm gap, it's really important that you make an impact through your communication, that you find words and phrases that are going to bring people along. Take this example from the Emperor of All Maladies. It was PBS special a couple years ago on cancer, talking about an oncogene. They didn't have to have every listener understand in detail the way an oncogene works, other than to say it's like an accelerator pedal in a car, driving tumor growth. And they went on to talk about stuck accelerator pedals. Became very vivid, very clear. And I know the Alda Center and their work always talk about having clear and vivid language to explain your science.
For tens of thousands of years, people have transmitted information, complicated, detailed information through story. And this is something that you'll hear about, the importance of story. And many scientists kind of are cautionary about this. Like, is that really something? Is story, maybe story's fiction? Well, no, it's not. This is how your brain is evolved to take in complicated information. It helps us understand and it helps us remember. And when we create something in a story format, we're going to end up with that same information for a long time into the future. But in today's scientific story forums, we're not sitting around the campfire, we're sitting in the lecture hall. And so we're going to use story formats that meet this new thing. We're not going to tell about monsters and dragons. Well, usually we're not. So here's a couple of story formats that are important for science. Warning, this did not work. This is something that you shouldn't do. Hooray, this worked as predicted. We all love the fact that our models or our simulations end up telling us something, and then we go do an experiment and we confirm the model. That's a great story. Serendipity. Wow, I was doing this thing and I didn't expect this and I found a completely new result. Isn't this cool? Everybody likes that story too. This is my story, the story of why you're doing the science you're doing, what's important to you. That's always a terrific story. But I want to spend a moment on a story that I think we all should use, a story format we should all use frequently, and that's called and, but, therefore. Let me start with the opposite of why this is a good story. How often have you heard this story in seminars? I work on this topic and this and this and this. Oh my God, I'm so bored. And this equation describes them. And this is another equation. And we did some data. Let's face it, you've heard that seminar a lot, right? And then at the end, it's like, and this is the work I'd like to do next. And by this time, you're ready to go and get a beer. Randy Olson is a marine biologist, PhD, who became a movie maker and got engaged in how to tell good stories. And he wrote several good books, the first of which is Connection. And in this book, he introduces the concept of and, but, therefore stories, which he says came from Trey Parker, the inventor of South Park. And in an and, but, therefore story, you start with a couple of ands, and I did this thing, and I observed something else, and I wrote an equation that describes them, but there's some mismatch. The equation doesn't quite describe them. Therefore, I examined where that came from. There's tension there. You have the and then you say the but, and everybody goes, oh, but what happened then? What's important there? And then you have the therefore. Then you have how you resolve the problem. This is a story. This is something that people follow really well.
And the great thing about stories is it lets you show who you are. And tenet number 8, in terms of getting your message across and standing out from other scientists, is to show up as human and credible. The more we can be ourselves in front of an audience, the more effective we are as communicators. If you can just get up in front of the room and imagine you're talking to a group of your friends, you're going to let your personality show. And that's become very, very important these days. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that 3M Company's been doing. They ran a study, their State of Science Index. I highly recommend you take a look at that. And as a result of that, they've come to appreciate that scientists are trusted, more or less, but they're not considered approachable. And we think that has to do with the fact that what Roger was saying earlier, you don't want to show emotion. You're used to being more academic in the way you talk and lecture. And what we're saying is be who you are. It's really important to be who you are. And there's some recommendations that Jayshree Seth, who was appointed as the chief science advocate for 3M, and her colleague Robert Britton have put together in some great material you'll find on their website. It's so important for you to advance your science by letting people see the person you are behind your science. And they've got a great series of videos called Beyond the Beaker. I highly recommend you take a look at them.
Fun stuff.
It's really great material, and it just shows the importance of encouraging people to be comfortable pursuing science, because you can still be a human. You don't just have to be a super smart person. And I think sometimes that's a little bit off-putting to people who don't think they have the chops to be a scientist. And once again, their recommendations have to do with connecting with your audience through story. So we can't emphasize enough the importance of doing that. And we wanted to share with you one of our favorite communicators who does a terrific job of showing up as human and credible. If you follow climate science at all, you may have seen Katharine Hayhoe. She is just tremendous. I highly recommend a TED Talk she did last November in Palm Springs if you want to hear some of what she does. And for those of you who are working on your own speaking style, she's just a great example of being herself in front of the audience. And she says, find common ground. What do you share? She's an evangelical Christian, and she often starts conversations about climate by talking about children, because that's common ground. Want to share a clip? She was interviewed by Anderson Cooper, and he put up a tweet from President Trump that she responds to here in this clip.
Brutal and extended cold blasts could shatter all records. Whatever happened to global warming? I just want to give you a chance to answer that question. What did happen to global warming? I mean, the president's saying, well, things are so cold. What about that old global warming?
Well, there's this little thing called winter that happens every year. And during winter, we have cold snaps. Weather is what happens on a certain day in a certain place. But climate is the long-term average of weather over at least 20 to 30 years. So even though last year we broke 10,000 temperature records across the whole U.S., we broke over 30,000 high temperature records the same year, and long-term, decade by decade by decade, the planet is warming, and we're seeing an increased risk of heat waves to go with it.
She comes across with facts and data, but in a very easy to understand way. And she certainly comes across as approachable and very human. The other thing she's got, which you'll enjoy, is her YouTube channel. She calls it Global Weirding and talks a lot about science in really compelling and interesting ways. If you study her approach, you will go a long way to make your way to become a scientist who stands out with your communication, because she does a truly tremendous job of setting that example. And as a result, she's had a lot of influence, which brings us to our next principle for effective communication.
We all want to have influence. We want to persuade people to do things. And Amy and I's guidance for you is to think about doing this patiently. The myth in science is that you're going to write the perfect proposal, you're going to write the perfect elevator pitch, you're going to have the perfect lines to convince somebody, you're going to get in front of the decision maker, and it's going to take your word and you're going to do it, and Congress is going to go out and write a new law and you're going to be done. Guess what? It doesn't happen that way. You have to take your time, you have to build up influence, you have to find out what people are doing, and the more important the topic is, the longer it takes to build up that kind of influence. Let's talk about how you might do that.
He's been at it with climate change for 10, 15 years now.
Oh, I haven't succeeded yet, Amy. I don't know, but I'm working on it.
But bringing a lot of people together to try to join the cause.
So let's think about how you might do this. We all think about that one meeting, that one pivotal session. Well, don't think about it that way. Think about it as a process. Think about first, maybe a series of meetings with somebody important, where you have a very short conversation with them to begin with, where you're saying, do we agree on what the need is? You know, here's what I think this is the problem. What do you think the problem is? And then listen to what they say. The next time you come back, you can say, well, I've heard what you said, and I think there's a good solution that matches what we both think the need is. You kind of try to seek their buy-in. And maybe only at this point, after you've had a couple of conversations with somebody, would you say, and here's what I think we could do about that. This is this process of gently coming along, working with someone, and not expecting to have it happen instantly. And this idea of engaging other people in your ideas is extremely valuable. When you're talking to someone that you want to be a partner, you need to have their input as well as your idea. You need to find out what they like and what they don't like. Enlist them in solving the problems. The word "and" is incredibly important. We hear all the time about scientists who have trouble getting their ideas across in meetings. And one of the methods that I use for doing that is to sit in the meeting and listen to what somebody else says that's pretty close to what I would like to have happen. And then I can say, well, what Sarah just said is, I think, really important, and I would like to add this idea to that. And is a magic word. Now, Sarah and I are allies. You can think through the approach together. You're going to get together after the meeting. You're going to say, wow, we both need to work on this. You're going to have a team that you're working now. This idea of infusing your ideas gently and just letting them evolve organically is a way to think about that happening, how your influence process is going to work. This dye drops into the water and it spreads slowly. This is the same way that you drop the nugget of an idea into a collaboration or into a policymaker's head. And you let that evolve and you see how they think about it, and then you spread it. Or maybe you engage other allies at that point. But it doesn't happen all instantaneously. It begins from a nugget and it spreads.
And if any of you have ever tried to do this with something that's really new and really different, typically you meet some pretty sharp resistance. So building alliances around the idea, seeding it in different places, and then stepping back and being less concerned about whether you get the credit for the idea or whether the idea sees the light of day. That's really important in advancing scientific work. And that's part of the strategic way of thinking about communication, is how can you enlist other people who are respected to get them to listen to what you have to say, especially if you're young in your career. unfortunately, sometimes when you're young, people don't spend as much time taking your word for things. So this is an important strategy for you.
In climate science, I'm not going to do it by myself. Nobody's going to do that. We have to collaborate thoughtfully. You have to seek allies, collaborators, supporters, combine your ideas. Think about what it is that's really going to solve the problem, that's not going to just stoke your ego, but actually get out and solve the problem. And these teams are the way that really important problems get solved. And you have to think about all these things. It's important to have the science, of course, but you also want to have funders. You want to bring them along with what you're thinking. Influencers, people who will talk to the funders for you are one of the most valuable friends you're ever going to have. Advisors, talking to people's science and technology partners. These are all kinds of relationships that are going to create this team, create this juggernaut that's going to get the work done for you in the long run.
So here's another homework assignment. Sit back and think about the work you're doing and how you want to advance it. And then ask yourself, do I have the right mix of players that are part of this effort? And how can I more strategically go out and build relationships with the people who have the potential to help advance your important work?
Here's an example of one of those collaborations that I'm a part of. When we started thinking about what we need to do to solve the climate problem, got together with an NGO called Carbon 180, and they're involved in trying to advance technology initiatives to clean up the atmosphere, to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And they talked to Arizona State University, to the president, Neil Crow of Arizona State. And we all agreed that universities today are not training enough scientists to do the things that we need to do, that in the future we're going to need 20,000 trained climate technologists who aren't being trained today. So we got this collaboration together that we call the New Carbon Economy Consortium. For a couple of years, we've been talking about what are the problems. We spent a week together in Arizona talking about what are the issues, what do we need to solve, and then how would we solve them, what needs to be done, government funding, university problems, university programs. And we wrote a white paper that the universities are now circulating to other universities and to government agencies to talk to them. And this is the kind of influencing patiently, collaborating thoughtfully, that eventually is going to have a huge impact. And I'm just a small part of it, but it's an important thing that I'm doing.
And that brings us to the last of our 11 principles, enabling your listeners to act. And in order to do that, you've got to start by being really clear about the goal you have and the purpose of your communication. And oftentimes, most of us in our daily work just talk. We don't take a step back to think about, what are we really trying to do here? What's the strategy behind this conversation? How is it going to get to the outcome I want? So there's another homework assignment for you. For the next few days, every time you get ready to sit down with somebody, think about why. What are you trying to accomplish? And see if you can tailor your communications in a way that helps you get there. So let's talk about how to do that. Besides being really clear about your purpose, you want to make sure that you're talking to people who can ultimately act on your behalf. And you want to leverage all of the conversations that you have with them to build support over time. Our first webinar for the Alda Center is up online, and it's about building trusted relationships, how you go about doing that. If that's a subject matter that you haven't spent time thinking about, we'd love it if you'd take a look. I think that you'll find some things that'll play into what we've talked about today and give you some really solid foundation for how to take approaches to relationship building, because relationships can be really long-term, especially in science. You know, it's rare that something happens overnight.
When I go to Washington with my young scientists, I tell them, pay attention to those young guys in the agencies that are the same age as you. You're going to be working with them for 30 years. When they're running the agency and you're the head of a major science organization, you're still going to be collaborating.
Yeah, because a lot of times scientists stay working on the same subject for a long period of time. So relationship building is something that if you can get good at that, it's going to help you stand out and help you advance your communication. And I want to take you back to one of the key practices in enabling your listeners to act, and that is making the ask. What do you want from people? Don't leave that to chance. Be really clear about it. And it can be as simple as, so what do you think? If you're in those early stages of salting an idea and trying to get some feedback on it. So what do you think is an ask? Would you tell some other people about this? Who else should I talk about this? Those kinds of asks can help you move your science along, especially in the early stages. And then when it comes to trying to get funding for your programs, very specific asks are important. And at this point, you got to put yourself in the shoes of the listener. What do they need to know? What do they need to hear? How can you make it easy for them to act? Well, if you're asking for funding, they're going to want to know what you're going to deliver, what it's going to cost, what the resources are. So you want to make sure that when you make an ask, you've done the foundation setting so that they are prepared to reflect on your request.
And let me give you a phrase that's really useful in this regard, because this is one of the most difficult things that scientists ever face, is how to ask for the money. And so a phrase you can use is, would you be willing to support this program? What would it take for you to be willing to support this kind of effort? Not judgmental. It's an easy thing. They can answer that without saying yes or no to giving you money.
Yeah, that phrase works really, really well. So in the interest of making an ask, we have an ask of all of you. We are looking for more great examples of effective communicators. We love video. We love slides. If you are someone who does a top-notch job covering some of the principles and practices we've talked about today, please send us some of your material or say hello so we can get to know you. Our efforts to reach out to more scientists and help them learn some of these things are really just beginning. And we appreciate all the people who've helped us to this point by sharing their wisdom and their information. And if you've got great examples, please send them our way. We would also love to have you join our mailing list at some point in the future. We'll be communicating about things we're doing, and we'd love to keep in touch. And fundamentally, what we want you to take away from today, besides doing your homework, make a half an hour or so to just reflect on what we've talked about and really do a little self-awareness here and self-assessment and see how you can integrate some of these principles. But fundamentally, remember that the details are the devil if you get into them way too soon. And like they tell you when you're about to get on a BART train or the New York City subway, you got to mind the gap.
That's right.
Thank you. And I think we've got some time for questions. James, if you want to open it up, we'd love to take questions.
So we have a first question here from Raisa. How do you ensure that extracting the essence does not translate into clickbait headlines? Wow, that's really important. We're all tempted by clicks and by citations, and it's pretty easy to get trapped into that. And I'm afraid that you simply have to use your good judgment there. Don't get trapped into memes. Don't say things that you hear other people say. Say the important thing.
Yeah, and be as fact-based as you can as you're extracting the essence. You know, talking about soybean waste as a productivity gain for crops is pretty fact-based. So we're not suggesting that you look for language that's hypey or in any way disingenuous. You always want to be directionally accurate, but you want to be clear. And, you know, sometimes that's a matter of playing around with language and asking people what they think. How does this sound to you? And if you ever want to ask us, if you're ever mulling over something, drop an email. I love to engage with people on that.
Amy's really good at that.
That's one of my favorite things to do. I've spent a lot of years helping people think about the nuances of words and how to think about that so you don't get in trouble.
That one looks like, next one looks like yours.
Okay. Do you have any advice for those of us who are not scientists but communicate on behalf of scientists? Oh, yeah. You know, your role is one of a translator. And I think there are a couple of things. First of all, I don't know any scientist that doesn't have a good story or two. So figure out if they like beer or wine or where to take them so that you can just break away from the day-to-day and chat about their experience. Be curious, find out how they got to where they are. And in that, I bet you'll find great stories. A colleague that we work with over at Gilead Sciences was telling us a story about one of her scientists and how, you know, there's a lot of criticism often of how much time it takes and how much money it takes to develop new drugs. And he was able to drive home how long it takes by talking about the day he was hired to do the job he was doing. His daughter was born, and how 4 years later, he remembers being on the soccer field when they had some early data that showed that this was bound for potential success. So having those personal stories really makes a richer kind of example, and it personalizes it. The more you can make things human, the better. And the other thing I would say quickly is aim for the concepts. Try to understand their concepts and how to take those concepts forward.
So Jen Gerber asked, do you have recommendations for engaging the special population of people who are scientifically literate but end up being vaccine deniers? This is a classic case that I spend a lot of time thinking about, is who are you going to spend your time on? And I don't recommend that people who develop obdurate opinions for unusual reasons that you spend much time with them, because you're just going to beating your head against a wall hurts after a while. But I also recommend that you try to start with the things that matter to people and make sure that you don't launch into the vaccines when you might share. Obviously, if you're caring about vaccines, you care about children. Let's talk about children first. So that's always the find the common ground question. Diana asked about building trusted relationships in another webinar. Yes, that's a previous webinar we did for ALDA Center, and that is on the ALDA webpage. Getting lots of questions. We'll try to keep up here.
Are there any fundamental principles for turning concepts into stories?
Yeah, the first principle is tell the story of why you're interested in that concept. I got interested in this because I'm a geologist, because I took a geology class just for fun, and I learned from that I could look around, and instead of just seeing hills and valleys, I saw a story. I saw what happened. I became excited about that. That's a story right there. So start with why you're interested in it.
Here's a question about paradigm gaps. I'm looking for examples of how you bridge paradigm gaps. You probably run into this talking to some of the VCs recently.
So, working in climate technology, one of the problems we face is that the ultimate source of information about climate sciences are these reports from the IPCC, this UN board that writes these incredibly authoritative reports on climate. And then they have these incredibly detailed things that they call summaries for policymakers. And oh my God, they're terrible. Mm-hmm. No one can read those things. I can't read those things and get the details of what's in there. And so that's a paradigm gap. The people in the IPCC who spend the time with those reports, people like Catherine Hayhoe, are enormously embedded in how that gets done, but other people don't get it. So that's a place where I have to think about, what's the simplicity of this? People think about blankets and the earth getting warmer and, blankets getting thicker and things like that. That's the kind of paradigm gap that you have to get to face. No one in the public thinks about climate the way that an IPCC author does. So you have to not respond in terms that they think about.
Any special recommendations for communicating or presenting to a panel of scientists, but from completely different fields? Yeah, that's what we talk about when we say you've really got to make sure you're understood. And that's where the idea of being able to demonstrate your expertise, but also use common language to bring along the people who are new to the subject. We also believe when you're in a situation like that it's okay to introduce a few new concepts you want people to learn or understand, but tell them that. Say, one of the things I'm going to be talking about today is osteophytes. And for those of you who are not familiar, here's how they cause problems, and here's what they mean for me when I'm doing surgery. These are bone spurs, and here's how they cause a problem. So think in terms of examples you can give that are concrete, and feel free to balance some of your technical language with more common language.
So Justin gets compliments on his passion during talks, and he wonders how to convince scientists that this is really important. Always start with the outcome. Scientists, we give talks because we want to have an outcome. And the outcome is never to tell people how much work we did. And maybe sometimes we think that, but ultimately we know we're trying to transmit other kinds of information. And so tell them, what do you want them to walk away with? What do you want your audience to think at the end of the day? And your passion is going to help convince them that, you know, your message is something that they should engage in.
And if you're trying to convince scientists to give talks, sometimes what you're up against there is that they just really don't like being up in front of the room. And the best advice we can give is that it takes practice, and it also takes an appreciation of why it matters. You know, as a scientist, you have a contribution to make. I can only imagine what the world would miss if scientists in the past hadn't been able to communicate their ideas. Now it's easier with the internet, but when you think about decades ago, how things got created, the invention of the electric light, I mean, it was a series of discoveries. And if those had not been communicated, it would have taken a lot longer to get to where we are today. So that might help you convince a scientist who's not as interested in getting up in front of the room. And then you have to give them support, because let's just say, over the years, I've worked with many a shy presenter, and it's so gratifying for them and for you when you get to coach them and bring them along and get them to a place where their voice can have an impact.
And I hate to say it because it's kind of clickbait, but there's just a series of tricks that you can do to make yourself better. And you may not believe this, but I'm a deep introvert. I have learned a series of tricks to do to be comfortable talking to 190 of you. It's just a series of things that I do. And that's what Amy and I are trying to transmit to you all. And once you have those tricks, you're going to feel more comfortable doing it.
Yeah, he literally will come home after a conference and be quiet for about a day and a half. But what he came to appreciate, and what we want all of you to appreciate, is that speaking up about your science is so important. You know, part of what the 3M findings show is that people don't understand and don't see the value of science in their everyday life. And all of us know it's everywhere, but it's because we don't talk enough about it. So finding a way to talk about your science effectively is going to make you stand out and help you take your work further. And that's why we're here, to try to help you be successful.
So Lachelle asks about communicating with people who have ADHD. And I don't think it's just in the environmental sciences that you're going to run into this. And basically what you're saying is, how do I communicate with somebody who's only going to give me a minute or two to get their attention? Well, that's the importance of starting with your message, paying attention to your opening line. Every one of you should sit down for half an hour after this and think about, what's my opening line that's going to get somebody's attention, that's going to buy me the next 5 sentences. You got to buy me the attention of that person because they care, because I've gotten it.
And use your ability as a scientist to experiment. Come up with 4 or 5 different approaches. Make a prediction, share a finding, ask a what if question, play around with some of those constructs we shared with you, and see which of those work the best. Test them out on people you know. Strategize about the person you want to get in front of, and ask people who know them, what do you think would get them most interested? You know, that's the kind of research that's going to enable you to make headway more quickly.
And we talk about a thing called self-aware and self-correcting, that you have to be the editor of whether your message is working. And so when you talk to a business leader and it didn't sink in, you have to go home and say, why? What did I do that didn't work with that person? And try something a little different, or ask your friends. If there was somebody else there at the meeting, ask them what they saw. Because of course, when we're talking, we're very caught up in what's happening. If you have, a friend along, a wingman, you can get some good advice on how to do a better job.
Looking for questions here. I'm an environmental scientist.
Oh, here's one on the difference between faculty conveying to students and scientists conveying to policymakers. Really important difference there is that you can challenge the students. You can go fast and hard and say, if you didn't get this, you better go read the book. And you can ask students around you, and that's fine because it's their responsibility to learn the information. But guess what happens if you do that to a policymaker? Okay, move on. Got to go talk to the cattle maker from Oklahoma now. You're going to lose them. You are responsible for getting the information across to somebody like a policymaker.
And doing some work up front, getting reading material to policymakers in advance that's succinct and clear and provides good background is always a great strategy. That's where working with a staffer comes in. They can help you know precisely how to tailor what you know for the benefit of the recipient. Where are you pointing? Hi, Amy.
Yeah, so we're getting used to all the different windows here, trying to answer everyone's questions. Well, this has been terrific. I'm glad that so many of you signed in. I hope it was useful. I hope you continue to follow us. Follow me on Twitter and Amy on LinkedIn and get more, keep up with what we're doing.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. And remember, mind the gap and watch out for those details.
Thank you so much for all your help and for doing this presentation for us. It was great having you.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.